Assalamu alaikum and welcome to all. Today we have a seminar by Dr. Reshman, Hussam. She's an assistant professor of business administration in the Business, Government and International Economy Unit, a faculty research fellow at NBER, and a faculty affiliate at JPAL. Her research area explores questions at the intersection of development and behavioral economics with the research in three key areas: migration, health, and finance. Her most recent work engages refugees population, including the Rohingya in the Bangladesh, and examining the psychological values of employment. With this background, I request Professor Hussam to give her talk on psychological well-being of employment. Over to Dr. Sam.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Let me just share my screen so I can pull up the presentation. Okay, great. So I'm hoping to speak until about 9:40, and then I'm looking forward to the conversation that ensues. So this is a project joint with Aaron Kelly, who's at the World Bank, Gregory Lane, who's at University of Chicago, and Fatima Zahra at NYU. And the evidence we'll be sharing is from the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. So before I jump into the study itself, let me ground us in some context. So here you see the Naf River. This is the river that separates Bangladesh from Myanmar, and Bangladesh is on the near side. And if you were standing here, excuse me, in August of 2017, you would have noticed smoke rising from behind those mountains in Myanmar, which came from villages that had been set ablaze by the Myanmar military in this massive ethnic cleansing campaign, which their military or the government labeled clearance operations, and which were labeled later deemed a genocide of the Rohingya Muslim ethnic minority. And what resulted from those clearance operations was the expulsion of 750 to 800,000 Rohingya refugees across the river into Bangladesh, who just in a matter of weeks built and settled into what is now the largest refugee camp in the world. This is also the most densely populated place in the world. So this is the setting for our study today. Now here is one refugee family, and I'd like to point out a few things. First, they're standing in front of their bamboo and tarpaulin shack, which they likely share with at least one other family. If you look inside, you will see not only is it very dark, but it's very sparsely appointed. So there's really hardly anything in there. Maybe a mat to sleep on, maybe some watering cans and a cooking pot, and that's it. Because of course they left everything behind when they fled. If you were to walk down this muddy pathway, you would notice lots of children playing, and you'd also notice that the women are likely to just be sitting inside their homes, and the men are likely to just be standing around, not doing much of anything. And if you were to go up to any one of these adults and ask them, how can I be useful? How can I help? You would be likely to get at least one of these two answers: help us go back home and give us work. So we have some other work that explores this almost puzzle of their request to go back home. In one way, it's very obvious they want to go back home because it's their home. In another way, it's shocking because they just fled genocide. So we explore that in some other work, and I'd be happy to chat about that later. But today we're going to explore the second question, which is the request to get work. Now, on the face of it, that's not strange. As I said, they've left with nothing. They have nothing. So maybe they want the work to get the income to rebuild their lives. But the interesting thing is that they use this term hatir kaj, which colloquially means handiwork. So it's something that women do. But men are also asking for this. And very literally, it means do something with my hands. They're asking for something to keep their hands occupied. Now, it's these sorts of conversations that make us think that their decision, their their act of standing outside doing nothing is not one of choice, but one of force. In fact, in this space, there is widespread unemployment because Bangladesh does not give work permits to these refugees. It's not legally permitted for them to work. This is common in many countries that host refugees and migrants. Neither can they freely come in and out of the camps to, for example, go into the local towns to get informal work because there are checkpoints that keep them within the camps. And finally, even within the camps, there's very few opportunities for informal work. So within our sample, only 11% of people report having had any wage work in the previous month. And among those, the average number of days they work is just 3 in the previous month. So it is extremely hard to find any sort of wage work in the space. So it's these sorts of conversations in this context that motivates our main question, which is what is the value of employment beyond its direct monetary benefit on well-being? Now, we're not the first to ask this question. There's a long tradition in sociology and psychology of exploring this question, but the literature faces, I'm going to focus on 2 main challenges. The first is that of selection, which is that if you are comparing the health and happiness outcomes of the employed to the unemployed, those 2 groups may be systematically different in ways beyond just their employment. They may be systematically different in ways that are correlated with that outcome that you care about. Now, even if you're able to overcome that, for example, you see a shock to employment so that suddenly some people get unemployed for no reason except by random chance, still you're faced with the challenge of mechanisms, which is that when you lose a job, not only do you lose your friends, your identity as a worker, the environment you're working in, but of course you also lose your income. And both of those things can impact your well-being. And we want to be able to tease those things apart. We want to understand what the non-pecuniary, non-monetary impact or value of employment is. So how do we do that? Well, what we're going to do is run a randomized control trial among 745 Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh in these camps. And we're going to involve them in this project by randomizing them into one of 3 arms. They're either in the control arm, in which they receive no work and a small fee for weekly survey participation so we can track their well-being. Or they're randomized into the cash arm, in which, again, they receive no work, but a much larger fee for weekly survey participation. I'll give you a sense of just how large that is in just a bit. Or they're randomized into the work arm, in which they get paid wage labor, in which the amount they get in wages is exactly equivalent to how much those in the cash arm are getting. And importantly, these interventions last for 8 weeks, which is far longer than, as I mentioned, among those lucky enough to get employment, the 3 days they get employment in a month. So the idea is we want to understand what the impact of a meaningful long-term, in this context, employment opportunity is. Okay, great. So just so you have a sense of who we're working with, I want to highlight just a few things. The average person in our sample is going to be a married man below the age of 30, although 30% of our sample will be women. Individuals are saving about $3. Individuals report having savings of about $3, but they're borrowing more than 10 times as much. So that suggests that they're very cash constrained, right? They're very liquidity constrained in this context, which to us implied that the cash intervention should be very valuable for them. But let's get to the results, and I'd love to hear your reflections. Now, not only are they monetarily constrained, but they're also suffering deeply on the psychosocial level. So as you can see by those last 2 observations, 40% of individuals qualify as moderately to severely depressed. This is a large percentage, but also not unlike, for example, Syrian refugees in Jordan. And 50%, nearly 50% report having had some suicidal thoughts in the last 2 weeks. So again, quite grim, but at the same time, not unlike similarly marginalized and vulnerable populations in the world. Okay, so just to repeat the design, it's a very simple design, but I want to hammer down the 2 main objects we're interested in. When you compare your control group to your cash group, we can elicit the psychosocial value of cash. And then when you can compare your cash group to your cash for work group, you can elicit the psychosocial value of work, okay? Okay, so how should you think about cash payments? The cash payments we give to the cash group are quite large. Okay, so they are about 60 US dollars PPP, but maybe the better way to think about it is that it's about doubling their potential consumption in these camps. So every refugee in these camps gets rations of food, of oil, lentils, and rice from the World Food Program. Now, the value of that, the market value of that, we offer you a cash amount, which is double the market value of that. Okay, so it's quite large in this context. I should also say that despite getting that, because they have no other access to cash, because they have no other access to other forms of income, they often have to sell these very meager rations, some part of these meager rations, to get the cash they need to purchase vegetables, to purchase maybe fish now and then, even to purchase salt or spices. So things that are quite basic in our diet, they need the cash in order to purchase. So again, cash seems like it's extremely valuable in this setting. I will say, having worked in many very impoverished settings, I have never encountered a setting more materially impoverished than this one. Okay, and another way to think about the cash is that if you were lucky enough to get work, you would make about 900 taka per month. This cash is doubling that amount. So it's well above also what you would get if you were lucky enough to find work in the camps. So that's the cash. Now, how do we think about the work? Well, when we were designing the work intervention, we wanted to incorporate the features that we learn as economists in our labor economics classes as key to being work. So something that is effortful, that requires attention and energy, and something that's a time substitute for leisure, right? We learn about the labor-leisure trade-off. So something that takes time. Empirically, in our context, the job we design took 2.5 hours of a workday. So it's not a full 8-hour job. You should think about this as a very simple part-time job. Okay, so read the results in the context of that, a very simple part-time job. We also wanted to incorporate the key features as we understand them from the sociology literature. Now, in the sociology literature, work is broadly understood to be at least nominally social and public. As in, you're not doing work in a dark room closed off all by yourself, and there should be some sort of purpose to it, some nominal purpose, some feeling of productivity. So beyond that, we also had to deal with the constraints of working in the camp. So we wanted to make something that was amenable not only to men, but also women, which meant we couldn't do manual labor, and something that's amenable to a low literacy workforce. So you'll see how we accommodate for that. So the way I want you to think about this work is it's neither too good nor too bad. It is taxing because it takes some time and physical effort in the heat outside, requires meaningful time and attention, but it has a clear purpose. And we have, the employer is us, and we're not going to be exploiting you or treating you poorly. So that's how you should think about this work. Neither too good nor too bad. So what's the work? So imagine this is refugee Muhammad. I come to Muhammad and I say, Muhammad, think about the various activities that people do in the camps. Now think about your 15 nearest male neighbors in the case of the male Muhammad. And what I'd like you to do is every day, 5 times a day, as signaled by the sun, this is the video we show them, I want you to go outside and tally up in this worksheet what those 15 neighbors are doing. I don't need to know names. I just want to get a sense of what the people in your neighborhood do throughout the day. And here is an exhaustive list of the various activities people might do. Here you see someone just standing outside doing nothing. Here they're at the tea stall. Here they're bathing. Here they're praying in the masjid, etc. Okay, and we do the same thing for women. So women survey women. And then at the end of each day, you drop your sheets, your 5 sheets, into this collection box. That way we can account for your time, make sure you're doing things in a timely manner, okay? So it's a very, very simple task. And again, it only takes 2.5 hours a day. Okay, so now before I go into the results, what I'd like to first convince you of is that people are actually doing the task, okay? So here we have task completion rates over the course of the 8 weeks, and you see across the board, everybody seems to be doing the tasks. Completion hovers around 98%, 99%. So that's comforting. Everybody seems to be completing the work. Now, what's the quality of the work? So this we also find comforting. What you find is that in the first week, 50% of people are making mistakes. But over the course of the next 3 weeks, that percentage drops down to about 2%. So what we interpret this as is that this task is not negligible, meaning it actually requires time and attention and effort to do well. And these individuals are exerting that time and attention and effort over time in order to perform well. So that's encouraging. And finally, we implemented this penalty, which is that if you make mistakes 3 weeks in a row, then you get docked pay. You don't get paid for that 4th week. And we find that very, very few people don't receive payment for their mistakes, which is comforting because that means that when you compare the outcomes for work to those of cash, you can rest assured that they're receiving essentially exactly the same amount of money between those two groups. Okay, so now let me jump into the results. Okay, so you don't need to read these regression tables. I'm going to interpret them for you, but the way I'm going to be presenting it is that the effect of cash, being in the cash group, and the effect of being in the work group, both relative to being in the control group, on your psychosocial outcomes. Okay, we include controls in kind of the gold standard way of today using a double selection lasso, and we include the fixed effects that we had pre-specified. All of this is in our pre-analysis plan as well. Okay, so what do we find? So here, column 1, the PS index, is the psychosocial index. This is a pre-specified index of the subsequent 7 outcomes. Okay, so sorry, let me just rearrange. Okay, so how do you interpret the subsequent 7 outcomes? PHQ is the standard validated tool for evaluating the likelihood of depression. Okay, when you see PHQ, traditionally higher scores mean more likelihood of depression. Here we flipped them. Okay, so PHQ and stress, you should read them negatively. That way, any positive effects you should think of as improvements in well-being, okay? So PHQ is about depression, stress is self-explanatory, there's life satisfaction, which you select on a ladder. These are all kind of validated scales that we drew from the psychology literature. Social is a number of positive conversations you have in the previous day. Self-worth is 2 questions. The first is, think about the person you deem to be the most respected and valuable in your family. Rate them at 10. Where would you rate yourself? And then we do the same question for the community. Think about the person you think to be most respected and valuable in your community. Rate them at 10. Where would you rate yourself? So it's an index of those 2. Control is the locus of control questions about how much in control you feel in your life. And stability is about how stable you feel now and how secure you feel about your future. Okay. And these estimates are all in standard deviation, so I'll help you interpret that. But overall, the first kind of take-home message is that employment seems to impact positively and statistically significantly every single one of our pre-specified margins. So that's very encouraging. That's a 0.2 standard deviation increase in the total index. Now, how should you benchmark this? Well, one way to benchmark it is that what we find PHQ, so depression rates, we find about a 20% reduction in the frequency of suicidal thoughts among those who are employed. So a margin that you might think is extremely hard to shift, we shift, this employment intervention is able to shift quite a lot. Another benchmark is that during the same time that we were running this program in our camps, in the camps we were working in neighboring camps, there was a psychotherapy intervention that lasted for 1 year. It was rather intensive. It was once a week for 1 year. And that psychotherapy intervention found a 0.15 standard deviation reduction in depression. Relative to that, we find a 0.24 standard deviation reduction in depression. So a 2-month employment program seems to, at the very least, have comparable effects, if not larger effects, than this sort of psychotherapy intervention. And the final benchmark that I think is quite informative is that, as you recall, these refugees fled a genocide. And the nature of the genocide was one of quite indiscriminate violence. So the Myanmar military entered these villages and threw firebombs into homes indiscriminately, shot people indiscriminately. So whether or not you lost a loved one in this violence was essentially random. In our sample, 88% of people have lost at least one loved one. And among those who lost one, they lost many. But if you compare those who lost a loved one to those who did not, you see a 0.26 standard deviation difference in depression. Those who lost a loved one are 0.26 standard deviations worse off in terms of depression. So compare that to the effect of the employment. Now, nothing can compensate for a loved one, but it does seem that the magnitude of that loss, at least as measured by depression scores, is in fact comparable to being unemployed in this setting. Okay, so I think I see that as kind of the most powerful benchmark. Okay, so that's the effect of work, the psychosocial effect of work. Now, is that different from that of cash? So, oops. Here is the test, the statistical test for whether the effects of employment are equal to those of the effects of cash. And this is basically saying that there is no statistical chance that those two things are equal. I mean, you can see it when you just look at the numbers. The impacts on cash are very small and not statistically significant, okay, across the board, except for life satisfaction, which also in other literature that evaluates the psychosocial value of cash, people have found that this measure seems to move. So it's unclear whether that's real movement or, movement because of the nature of this question, but it seems that across every other measure, we really don't see much movement at all, if any. Okay. Now, again, this to us was totally shocking because we are working in the most impoverished, materially impoverished setting any of us have ever worked in, likely some of the most materially impoverished people in the world. And yet the cash itself, on average, seems to be doing very little, while the employment in which you get the same amount of cash, but you're working for it, seems to be doing quite a lot. Okay. So how about some other outcomes? Beyond psychosocial, we also collect some physical and cognitive measures. So here you see that individuals in the employment arm, that's this top one again, report a significantly fewer days that they feel physically sick, okay? Now this is self-reported, so we don't actually measure anthropometric outcomes, for example. It could be that people are just believing they feel better. It could be, this seems the most likely given the existing literature, that a reduction in depression and an improvement in mental health translates into better physical well-being. So we suspect that that's what's really happening here. We also find, very surprisingly to us, a huge improvement in your cognitive index. So the cognitive index is a simple index of basic arithmetic questions and a very basic memory test. And we find that those who work despite their work not being intellectually challenging, they perform far better on this index than those who are just receiving cash. The risk aversion is an incentivized game that elicits how much you like risk. We find that your risk aversion goes down if you are working. In other words, your desire to take risks goes up. So you become more risk-taking, which is in fact one of the motivations behind UBI, so universal basic income, is that if you give people some kind of insurance, right, in the form of some basic income, they'll be more willing and able to take the risks that will yield them higher return. Now, interestingly, we don't see that from the cash, but we do see it from the work, which suggests there's some sort of psychological insurance operating here that allows people to feel safer about taking risks. Now, of course, we did find column 8 that people feel more stable and secure about their future in the work group, but not in the cash group. So that again is consistent with this effect on risk taking. And we find nothing on time preferences. It's unclear whether that's because there is no change in how you perceive the present and versus the future, or if just the question we asked was not the right one for this context. Okay, so those are kind of the main headline outcomes. And hopefully from there, I have convinced you at the least that there is some psychosocial value of employment above and beyond that of cash. Now, the next step is to ask, okay, so this exists, but do people internalize it, right? Are people recognizing this psychosocial value? So what we do to elicit this is that we, at the end of this 8 weeks, we come to those who had formerly worked and we tell them, surprise, we have just a little bit of funding left, and we'd like to complete one more week of work with this funding. Unfortunately, it's not enough funding to give everyone, all of you, the going wage rate, meaning the wage rate you were paid in the last 8 weeks. So we'd like to know 2 things. First, are you interested in doing another week of work? And if so, at what wage would you be willing to perform this work? Okay, it's the exact same work. So what do we find? The first thing we find is that 99% of people we ask, 99% of the former workers say, yes, I would like to work another week. And at what wage? Well, here, oh no, that's very strange. Okay, doesn't matter. The key part is showing. So what we find, this is a CDF, a cumulative distribution function of the wages, their reservation wage, which they are reporting. And what you find is that 70% of people who are interested in working, which is 99% of all people, are willing to work at a wage rate of 0. So they're willing to work for free for that extra week. So if they say they're willing to work for free, we say, okay, that's very generous, thank you. But in fact, our NGO has offered this other opportunity, which is that you could answer this very simple survey for which the NGO will pay you X amount. We randomize that amount. So you could choose to either answer the simple survey for X amount, or you could work for free. Which one would you prefer? And of those 70% of people who say they want to work at a wage rate of 0, 70% of those are in fact willing to give up 200 taka, which is about their baseline savings amount, to just work for free. So they're willing to give up money that they could receive and to instead work for free. Now, there may be some experimental artifacts which make you question the exact magnitudes, but what we draw from this exercise is that, in fact, people recognize that there's value to work beyond the income itself, and they are actually want to engage in the work for the work itself. Now, I want to put a huge cautionary note on this. This does not mean this exercise does not legitimize paying people at their reservation wages, right? It doesn't legitimize paying people 0 or a negative amount. This is simply saying that people are internalizing the additional value of the work. There are, of course, enormous social, intergenerational, and even present reasons why individuals need income, and I'm happy and excited to explore that in the Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to jump through potential confounds. We can chat about those later, and you can see them in the paper. But in my last few minutes, let's jump into probably what you're wondering about, which is what caused this large impact of employment above and beyond cash. So let's explore some mechanisms. So the first question that we ask here is, does the nature of the employment matter at all? The employment that we gave, as you saw, took very little time, and it was an extremely simple sort of work. How could such a simple activity generate such high returns in terms of psychosocial value? So one thing we can test is, so here's the thought experiment. The thought experiment is, what if the nature of employment doesn't matter at all? What if I just came to a people and I said, hey, you're employed, gave them like 2 hours of work, and others are not, and that had some long-term effects because they just want to feel the label of being an employed person. So what we can do here is, conveniently, we have variation in how many days an individual worked in a given week over weeks. Okay, so it's essentially random variation that we built into this program. So for example, I may have worked on Monday and Tuesday of a given week, and I was surveyed on a Friday, right? Because we do those weekly surveys. Whereas someone else worked on a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of a given week and was surveyed on a Friday. Now, each of us overall gets the same amount of employment, right? So the next week I will have worked on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That person will have worked on a Monday, Tuesday. But the point is that the distance between when I get surveyed, which is always the Friday, and the last time I worked will vary across time and across people. So that's what we're going to exploit to see if the actual nature of the work matters, or if it's just that you're employed. Okay. So here, what we find here, you should again read stress in the negative. We flipped it. So higher amounts are improvements in psychosocial well-being. We find that the longer it's been within a given week since you've worked, right? If last time I worked was a Tuesday rather than a Thursday, my well-being goes down significantly and my stress goes up significantly, okay? So it seems to actually be the nature of the work, the act of doing the work, not just a label of being employed. So what is it about the nature of the work? There's a lot of possible things it could be. Let me dwell a bit on this quote from the South African Supreme Court of Appeals, which I think highlights this quite well. The freedom to engage in productive work, even where that is not required, in order to survive is indeed a part of human dignity. For mankind is preeminently a social species with an instinct for meaningful association. Self-esteem and the sense of self-worth, the fulfillment of what it is to be human, is most often bound up with being accepted as socially useful. Okay, so they are highlighting so many different dimensions of what work can do, right? Feeling socially useful, feeling productive, having self-esteem and self-worth, dignity. So all of these different margins that can move. So we try to investigate what is moving. Now, I'm not going to go through everything, but I will highlight what we find is really moving. Okay, so here, what I'm showing you is, what I'm showing you here is the correlation between my depression rates and how where I rank myself in terms of self-worth within my family versus within my community. Now, this is just correlations at baseline. And what you find here is that where I rank myself within my family is highly correlated with how depressed I am. So the higher I rank myself, the less depressed I am, because remember, these are PHQ, we flipped to the side. Now, conditional on that, where I rank myself in my community has no impact on my depression. Okay, so it seems to be that we're really driven in this context by how we feel in terms of our value within our family. Okay, so now what is the effect of the employment program on this ranking? Oh. What we find is that individuals in the work group experience an increase in their ranking, and individuals in the cash group, in fact, experience a decrease in their ranking for their family. And the difference between these two is statistically significant. Okay, so what it seems to be is that, well, actually, let's just dig into this. What's really happening here? We suspect this has something to do with the gender margin, right? How our roles in the family are deeply tied to gender, especially in this context. So let's break it up into gender, into the sexes. So first, we go back to the total psychosocial index. We find that men and women both benefit significantly from work. Now, men hardly benefit from cash, while women benefit much more. Okay, so these coefficients are closer to each other. Now, let's dig in a little deeper. This difference seems to be driven by your depression, right? So again, women seem to benefit both from work and cash. We're not powered to get statistical significance here, but it seems they're both benefiting. But men benefit enormously in terms of depression rates from work and not at all from cash. And finally, let's look at their value to family, so their ranking within the family. Women seem to improve their ranking basically exactly the same, whether they get cash or whether they get work. Seems to be driven by the economic agency that they get. Whereas men have a huge improvement in work and, in fact, a decline in cash. And these two things are statistically different from each other, as you can see here. Okay, so it seems to be driven, this difference between employment and cash seems to be driven by men and how they feel in these contexts, maybe unsurprisingly, as traditionally they're the breadwinners, between getting work, which improves their self-esteem and self-worth vis-a-vis the family, versus getting cash, which we have suggestive evidence, in fact, reduces their self-esteem relative to getting nothing. Okay, so we found that quite interesting and surprising, and we're going back in the field to run a second round of this in which we're more statistically powered to really get at these more definitively. Okay, there's a bunch of other margins we explore. We don't really find evidence that other margins are shifting, at least not nearly as much as social status within the family. And if you're interested in heterogeneity on other margins, not just gender, but also, for example, according to the trauma you experienced back in the refugee camp, back in Myanmar, we have those exercises in the paper. Okay, now I'm basically out of time. Let me just summarize what we've learned and just end with some policy thoughts. So first is that work leads to these substantial improvements in psychosocial well-being. I gave you those benchmarks. In particular, the treatment effect on depression is equivalent to not having a loved one murdered in Myanmar. Now, these improvements are significantly different from that of cash, which in our evidence seems to have limited, if any, psychosocial impact. Individuals seem to understand or internalize the psychosocial value of work. In fact, they're willing to give up money, which is extremely valuable to them, in order to work for free. And men seem to benefit substantially more from work and effectively zero from cash. And the mechanism seems to be self-worth vis-a-vis the family, while women appear to benefit nearly equally from work and cash, suggesting that it's really the financial and economic agency dimension which they're most deprived of and therefore benefit most from. Okay, policy implications, which is where I'd love to continue the conversation. Of course, this should apply to the refugees in the world. We are at a historic high and will only continue to grow with climate change and all of the other downstream impacts of that. Very few of these refugees are resettled per year. This is not a temporary problem. This is very much a permanent problem. 70% of refugees face legal restrictions on the right to work, let alone all of the extra legal barriers that all migrants face in every country that receives refugees. Here is an example of one Syrian refugee in materially one of the nicest refugee camps we know. We wake up, we sleep, we wake up, we sleep, we eat food. There's no purpose in a life like this. One day is like another. But beyond refugees, I hope we can at least start exploring how these results have implications for the long-term unemployed in the developing world, of which there is at least 22 million, and also the incarcerated, for whom we know they're willing to work for pennies on the dollar. That doesn't justify paying them pennies on the dollar by any means, but it suggests that they are deprived not only materially, but also deeply psychosocially. And so we should be attentive to both of those margins far more in our policy literature. So now I'd like to end with a quote from Amartya Sen. As we think about designing government transfers, as we think about designing UBI, universal basic income, as we think about the increased polarization in the world that is often sourced to large-scale unemployment, let's think about it not only as a material deficiency, but also as a psychosocial, psychological deficiency. So he says, but the unemployment is not merely a deficiency of income that can be made up through transfers by the state. It leads to losses of self-reliance, self-confidence, and psychological and physical health. Great, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your talk. So now we are open for questions. So please raise your hand for questions. So meanwhile, let me start with the observation that with this. So basically at PIDE, we also thinking about the value of work rather than giving cash, because if we look into the debate of this cash trauma over the last 2 or 3 decades, everyone is say that the cash is good and this unconditional cash transfer has a massive impact on generating employment and also reducing the poverty. But if we look into the most recent shocks, especially this COVID, so there is a significant reversal in these poverty numbers, especially in developing countries. This raises another question: what is the resilience of these cash transfer programs, whether they have a long-term impact or not? So I think in this context, it is very important to shift our focus rather than giving this unconditional cash transfer that is also have some attached values in terms of this psychological well-being apart from the consumption means. So this shift would be important, one, to create a resilient society where they have a decent employment, two, to create some sort of psychological values beyond this income means. So this on the one hand uplift the status of these people and also create a long-term sustainable society. So the PIDE is also focusing on these issues, and we are working how the opportunities can be created for these posts. So I think it's a very good starting point to reshape the discussion on this cash transfer versus the employment need of the people. And in Pakistan, you aware that there is like a massive refugees across the border in KPK over the very long time period of time. So probably government can think how they can reintegrate these people in terms of supporting and them, and also giving them some sort of employment opportunity to look into these issues. So I think this is like a very core issue in terms of addressing the needs of the even not only the refugees but also the people those are living below the poverty line. So rather than focusing on cash, we have to think differently. So I'll stop here. Dr. Khalid, you have a question? Please go ahead. Dr. Khalid?
Yes, thank you. Very nice presentation, and really learned a lot. Quick questions, and these are maybe not directly relevant to the outcomes, but the structure of the experiment. In your opinion, if we think about situations which are similar to the same which you have selected, but thinking about a long-term solution where the problem is not of kind of an acute nature, and the problem is lying there for more time, and it's likely to be the same, especially as Dr. Saab has just mentioned that Pakistan is facing a geopolitical crisis as well as within Pakistan, since certain urbanization and other activities are happening. So we might have something which is happening over the long run. So do you think that the same analogies could be made for interventions which are long-term in nature, and the people are not going to get a knowledge in terms of these interventions and think about an alternative ways where this is not sustainable? That's question one. The second is that, do you, in your opinion, is this mechanism the only option? Because when we think about certain other possibilities as well, for example, to me, at times I feel that it's not person-centric. Maybe we need to think one step above, where the locality or the area where to that particular concentration of the population lies, that can also be one of the options of financing and getting some jobs into it. So from that perspective, what is your idea that do we need to focus only on the individuals themselves, or we have to think out of the box and maybe move one step above and think about their employability as one of the options where individuals could be taken out of the poverty trap for long-term solution? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions, Dr. Khalid. So on the first one on long-term sustainability, so I view this refugee crisis, I mean, we intervened, or we entered when it was really a crisis, and in that it was happening in that moment, but this will be a long-term thing. I mean, the likelihood of return is low. Given what we've seen from previous exoduses of the Rohingya from Myanmar, they will probably be remaining in this country for generations. And so I think at the very least, in fact, I mean, I hope this project can be a model for longer term employment projects or evaluations of longer term employment exercises. I think it's encouraging that we found that only within 2 months, for such a simple and kind of part-time work, we find these effects. In my mind, that just suggests that longer term projects will have larger effects and more downstream effects, intergenerational effects, spillovers to other members of the community, et cetera. But I think that's an empirical question that we should certainly be exploring, because all of these refugee crises, we know, will be lasting more than just a few years. While these refugees hope, and often the host community hopes, they will be returning, it's very unlikely. It often does not happen that way. And that, is connected to your second point, which is that, right, the way we intervene, the way we designed this was very much kind of a small NGO designing these things just for these individuals. But ideally, this would translate into government programs that, like national employment schemes, right? So, or maybe local employment schemes. The challenge here, of course, especially when you're working with migrants, is the margin of integration, right? That a lot of the reasons migrants face labor market barriers is not the legal ones, but because the host community doesn't want them there. They face enormous discrimination, they face challenges in the experience of integrating, which make the employment process so much harder. So that's a part we ignored in this particular experiment because we were working within the camps. But realistically, if we think about how to employ this on a larger scale in a sustainable way, it requires that we navigate those questions of politically very sensitive questions of integration. But what we hope is that this sort of evidence will bolster support for these national employment schemes and bolster support for loosening these tight restrictions on migrants in the labor market, because it is true in some contexts empirically that when you have a large workforce that has lower reservation wages in the host community, your wages, especially for low-income workers, will go down. So that is true and something that needs to be navigated, potentially with cash assistance, right? But at the same time, think about all of the positive downstream impacts that could come from the proper integration of these migrants into the labor force, not just in terms of productivity in these spaces, but also in terms of the psychological margins that we were exploring here. So I think it's a complicated thing. It's something that we did not touch and we should touch if we're thinking about really implementing this in the wider policy space.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? So let me ask few questions later to this discussion, then probably we have another question. So when we talk about these RCTs, the one question is we are basically nudging few segments and ignoring the others. So do you feel this basically the change is primarily driven by the event itself, not the because they are now so conscious about the reporting their behavior, because there is some incentive attached with these interventions. So probably this also reshape their preference and their responses according to the, because they know that they might, because they are different from the people, those are control group, and they have to behave differently. So how you feel that this will affect the overall outcome of the study?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the way I'm interpreting your question is, do we think there are experiment or demand effects? Meaning, is the experiment itself encouraging people to behave and report a certain way? So one thing that, alleviates our concern on this is that our main comparison is not between work and control and cash and control, but rather work and cash. And if anything, those in the cash group have more reason to please the experimenters than those in the work group, because they're getting cash for free. Whereas the work people feel like they're earning it, right? They're working for it. So it seems like a very logical thing to be paid for some work. So, so it seems like the way experimenter demand effects typically go, we would be biased downwards, in fact. So the effects we're estimating would be down, underestimates of the true effects, because if anything, either both groups, cash and work, will be equally upward biasing their results, or cash will be differentially upward biasing because they should feel more indebted to the experimenters. But beyond that, even, that's not something we can empirically test. But that's why we also included the sorts of measures that can't be just twisted by perception or by reports. So that's why we have the cognitive measures. Whether or not your memory is good is not something you can really change. It's something that either happens or it doesn't. And that's why we had the labor supply measures, because those are incentivized with quite a lot of money. Same with the risk aversion, that's also incentivized with quite a lot of money in this space. And so at least the evidence that exists out there suggests that experimenter demand is eliminated when the stakes are sufficiently high. Like basically what you might be losing if you answer a certain thing are sufficiently high, you're going to answer truthfully rather than the way you expect you believe somebody expects you to answer. So those are our hopes, but it's a very fair concern and something we should always be concerned about in these sorts of surveys that we do.
Yeah, and relevant to the same, that when we talk about the intervention that we are designing, then how we ensure that this would be the optimal level of intervention in terms of cash. Like if the idea is to give them some sort of consumption support, probably then we have to first measure their consumption need and then try to figure out what amount basically will help them to keep their status
That's right.
similar.
Yeah.
So how you feel that this 2.5 hours work is good enough to change their preference? Because it's like as you earlier mentioned, it's like a very part-time job and there is nothing attached with it. Just you have to work around your neighborhood and just to pick few farms, and then probably this also, maybe I'm just thinking very loudly, that maybe it also gives a sense that this is just like some sort of donation that people giving to us just to work around your family. This is nothing, this is not just like a hardcore work that probably they are assuming to shift their like the mental attitude from the low thinking to the high thinking.
I mean, it's true. So I can't comment, for example, on manual labor. It's possible that if we give people manual labor, they would be much more unhappy. To be honest, I suspect, of course, you should not engage in exploitative labor. So let's be very clear about that. And yeah, this project can't comment on other types of work, but at the very least, in fact, we think, I guess, seeing that it's only 2.5 hours of work a day and the work is really quite simple and yet shifts things so much, makes us think that, it actually makes us think, what is the nature of the work that moves you so much? Like, what if you just got people to volunteer in their community? Could that do the same thing? So we're actually exploring that in a new project in which volunteering is just doing this work without pay, right? So how much of this is simply from your experience feeling useful in the community or feeling useful, in this space? We suspect it's not the entire amount because of that evidence we see with family, right? It's not that the work makes you feel more useful in the community. It's that it makes you feel more useful within the family, which probably has something to do with you feeling like you're satisfying the breadwinner role of earning money by doing something productive. But, these are questions that, well, hopefully, I encourage people to explore these more in the policy and the empirical space, because what I hope we're doing is just opening up a larger research agenda around really what it is about work that matters. I will also say, as we move towards this world of attention to cash transfers and universal basic income, I don't want to say that these two things are substitutes for each other. Even though we set up the experiment that way, I don't think that's true. I think that universal basic income and cash transfers have an extremely important role to play among marginalized communities. It's not just about your own psychological health. It's about increasing your outside options, increasing your bargaining power, increasing intergenerational wealth. There's so much value to cash itself in the world we live in. So I'd rather like to think of these two things as complementary, that people need cash for other reasons, but they also need some sense of purpose and direction, perhaps that they are also paid for, even if it's a very small amount, very short amount of work. So that's where I want our heads to kind of be as we move into the policy space.
Yeah, when we go into the field and if like one is treated with some sort of like asset support or the income support, and the asset transfer is meant to create some sort of employment. I know they have the decent employment, so they are working well. So when we ask a very subsequent question that did you need an additional support or for any support for the consumption purpose, suddenly they said yes. So this also linked with how the experiment would have a different meaning for the different people. And probably I was just reading the paper of Banerjee, the one of the experiment they did in India to see this half kg, 1 kg lintel would change the preferences of the people toward the use of healthcare services. So if it is so simple to give a 1 kg lintel to these people, and suddenly the take-up rate would increase substantially, then what are the main hurdle behind implementing this is a universal health access and so other things. So I don't think it's a very simple. So yeah. Thank you so much. If there is any other question from the audience, let's wait for a few seconds if there is any other question.
No, it's not a question. I just wanted to ask her that if it's an ongoing study, maybe she can also keep us posted in terms of how the results are coming up, and we can keep learning from her exercise actually.
Oh, that's very kind. Yeah, I'd be very happy to. So the new version of the study that we are hoping to launch in about a month is basically this study, but really focusing on the gender margin, looking at inter-household bargaining power, intimate partner violence, social norms around masculinity and work. So that margin, and then also trying to tease apart the volunteering versus work. So what is it about the work? Is it just the nature of the act, or is it getting money for doing something productive that is shifting it? So yeah, those are lessons that I'm excited to learn, and I'd be happy to share once we have some evidence.
Great, looking forward.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Reshman, for your time and patience to teach us in terms of how this RCT would work in different circumstances and different contexts. So really, it would be good if we look into the way the refugees are camped in Pakistan. Probably that could be another interesting context where we can see how the fact would change when there is a long term, the camping there. So if we look into the implication of this war, and suddenly there is some sort of possibility of return. Now the people can go back to their homes, but they are preferring to stay there. So how this when there is a different context, how it will change the preference of these people. So maybe in the near future we can think of studying these people as well, especially about the social psychological behavior and the satisfaction they attached while living in these camps rather than returning to their home. So with these remarks, I'm thankful for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
So with this, we conclude our today's webinar. Thank you so much for the participant. Take care.